I should never have imagined that behind the massive walls which surrounded the outer court of their temple there was room for such tumultuous movement as we encountered. But it was here that the real life of Jerusalem was mirrored. We found ourselves between two walls, or, more correctly, between two rows of columned arcades. The section leading toward the outer wall was studded with 4 rows of Corinthian columns. The floor was worked throughout in mosaic, while above us stretched a roof of cedar wood. Here we found a multitude of shops, stands, and money changers' tables, among which circulated an enormous and motley multitude. Along the line of columns which followed the wall of the inner temple court, there were countless balconies, labyrinths of buildings which must have housed innumerable inhabitants. We saw, through the apertures of the balconies, the gleam of unfriendly eyes. We did not have time to take close note of our surroundings. Our faces were turned forward in the direction of our march, which now led us toward the 14 rows of marble steps which barred our approach to the inner entrance of the temple. The gateway was open, but across it stretched a golden chain on which still hung the fragments of a broken eagle. That eagle had once symbolized the might of Rome. It had been placed there by Herod the Great in honor of the Caesar, but the fanatical Jews had broken it off. Herod had punished the Jews with a massacre for this act and had restored the eagle, but the Jews had removed it again. The blood grew hot in our hearts when we saw this evidence of lèse-majesté, and it was with feelings of mingled anger and sorrow that we approached the 14 steps, where we were awaited by a deputation with the high priest at its head. The high priest was not wearing his official vestments. He was wrapped from head to foot in a glittering mantle of silver thread, the symbol not of his religious but of his civil power. He was a man of lofty stature, like his father-in-law. Again, like his father-in-law, he wore his beard in the double-pointed style, but in his case the beard was more curled. On his head he carried a crown-like tiara, and on his forehead flashed a diadem. But most striking in his appearance were the heavy curls which flowed from under the tiara. They had been woven with such extraordinary art, so delicately and minutely, that the headdress resembled the product of an unimaginably fine loom. The suite accompanying him was not particularly large, and contained very few priests. These could be distinguished from the other members by their pure white garments, their trousers and tunics, their colored girdles, and their cap-like head coverings. As we learned later, they were his brothers-in-law and the officials of various departments, treasurers, and overseers. The high priest excused himself before Pilate for not having appeared with as large a retinue as was fitting for a reception to the Roman procurator. He explained that the priests were having a busy day in the temple. The Jews of Babylon, of Persia, and of northern Africa had sent in large consignments of cattle to be offered up as sacrifices in the temple, and the priests were occupied in the holy services. As against this, however, he could report that there were present in his suite the first representative of the temple, after himself, a former high priest, and all the other high functionaries. These, the sons of Hanan and his brothers-in-law, represented not only the temple and the priesthood, but likewise the highest court, the Sanhedrin. He alluded also to another 2 or 3 old men, whom he introduced as important interpreters of the law, sages, as it were. They, too, he said, were friends of the Romans, for they belonged to the party of enlightenment, which wanted peace with the Romans, to wit, the party of the Sadducees. Pilate's fleshy nose sank downward. He glanced at the party furtively from under his heavy eyelids and said, briefly, "That we shall see. It depends on goodwill." "On one side at least that goodwill always exists," answered the high priest. "That will have to be proved by deeds," said Pilate, and made a sign to the trumpeters to continue on the march. They began to ascend the steps toward the gate leading to the inner court of the temple. The face of the high priest turned pale under the flashing tiara. "The residence of the procurator is in the city," he cried, terrified, and pointed outward. "In the Herod palace." "I know that, but I plan to pass this night with my troops in their quarters in the Antonia," answered Pilate, and signaled to the trumpeters to resume their march. Suddenly there came a wild pealing from the ram's horns of the sentinels posted in the balconies about the gate, and the 2 massive gold-covered doors swung to from within. We were shut out. The high priest, pale as death, his eyes glittering like the blade of a sword, stood in the middle of the closed gate, and, without uttering a word, pointed to the 2 bronze tablets in the wall on either side of the gate. On these appeared, in Greek and Latin, the following inscription: "Beyond this point none of the uncircumcised may pass under penalty of death." "Ah, yes," said Pilate, and I observed the trembling in his thick lower lip, while an angry colour mounted his face. I had almost forgotten, and yet, if I am not mistaken, Romans have passed under that gate. I should like to know how Pompey captured the temple, undeterred by those inscriptions. He made use of the Sabbath, procurator, when the Jews may defend themselves, but are forbidden to attack. Today we are a little more advanced. In any case, he received his punishment from God, and the great Caesar took vengeance on him for us. It appears that your God is quite powerful to have such strong alliances. All the greatest men of Rome, with mighty Caesar at their head, and it is our hope that the new procurator of Judea will be among them," said the high priest with a disarming smile. "That will depend on the attitude of his believers. Centurion, lead the cohorts back to the procuratorium." Pilate himself, accompanied by a small detachment, made his way to the Antonia through the court of the Gentiles. We passed between 2 columned walls. Under these columns were the stalls of the merchants who sold the smaller sacrifices for the temple. There were dealers in turtle doves of a special kind fit for sacrifice, dealers in spices and incenses, dealers in fine white meal and in precious oils, dealers in all such objects as could be brought before the priests as offerings for purification from sin, or in payment of the tributes laid by their God Jehovah on his chosen people. And besides these, there were the money changers, sitting at their tables and accepting against the currency of the country the currencies of many lands. What an extraordinary assortment of men and of costumes was to be seen here under the columned walls! There were Jews from Abyssinia, with white sheets about their bodies and barefoot; Jews of Alexandria, or the noble Greek islands, in woolen and rough sheepskin garments, with palms and golden circlets on their curled heads; Jews from the desert, draped in camel hides or even lion skins; men of Galilee in simple working garb consisting of sackcloth, their faces hardened like rock by sun and labour. There were the poor, whose wretched clothes scarcely hid their nakedness, and the rich, with gold rings on their hands and gold stripes on their mantles of fine linen woven and dyed in Zidon. There were also Jews from remote Babylon, where the legions of Rome have never penetrated, and Jews from the cold west, where the footsteps of legions have been heard, and Jews from the Rhine, with heavy head coverings of wild skins. I did not know, until I saw this vast diversity of faces and costumes in the court of the Gentiles, that the Jews were so widely scattered throughout the Roman Empire and beyond its borders. I became convinced of the wisdom of Cicero, who warned us against the evil influence of this people, which fills all the markets of East and West, and has footholds in all the known and unknown lands. I must confess that when I gazed on the multicolored crowds, the riot of costumes, the varieties of racial shadings which swarmed through the gates of Judea's temple, I began to appreciate the foresight of the Roman rulers, who had always exerted themselves to remain on friendly terms with the Jews, had respected their religious cult, and had accorded them special privileges. A people so diffused throughout the world, able everywhere to exert influence, must enter into the calculations of every ruler. I paid close attention to the people and to the commerce with which went on about the temple. I knew that I should long continue to have dealings with them. I could not help being impressed by the religious ecstasy which they manifested even in this place, outside the temple wall, as they made their purchases for their little sacrifices. I noticed with what infinite care they examined the doves, choosing the sleekest, the richest in feathers, the most perfect in appearance. I noticed with what rejoicing they exchanged their good gold for precious oils and essences, compounded of the most exotic incense plants, and for the fine white meal. It was as though they were choosing gifts for a beloved, or a present for a mighty ruler whose favour they sought. Not at all as though these tenderly chosen objects were to be dedicated to some imaginary deity whom none of them had ever seen, and to whom no artist had yet given eternal form in marble or bronze. As far as I could make out, their religious service actually began there and then with the purchase of their sacrifices. They did not bestow a glance on our cohorts, marching through their midst. They did not manifest the slightest interest in their new procurator being carried past in his litter. They were too deeply absorbed in the purchases they were making for their God. I observed one poor woman, whose only dress was a covering of sackcloth through which showed glimpses of her skin. She was engaged in purchasing, it must have been with the last of her money, 2 turtle doves, and when she had obtained possession of them, she kissed them, she pressed them to her bosom, she caressed them, she murmured to them with an expression of such extreme piety that she seemed to be entrusting them with a message which they were to deliver into the ear of her God. I saw a broad-shouldered and powerful man holding in timid and tender fingers a twig of incense. He seemed to be afraid of crushing it. He gazed on it with imploring eyes, as if the plant had the magic power to lift off his shoulders the burden of sin which crushed him. I saw youngsters hurrying by with pans of white meal and cruses of oil. There was a universal and happy absorption in the service of the temple, and no one had a glance to spare for the man who had been sent from the center of the empire to wield over them the power of life and death. Deprived as we were of the emblems of our legions, of our eagles and shields, we did not look like a Roman legion marching through a city subject to Rome, like the entourage of a procurator sent out to govern a province, but like a loose band of wandering mercenaries in the camp of a foreign army. I looked from time to time at Pilate lying in his open litter, and I saw that his heavy face and thick neck were flushed with blood, that the veins on his temples stood out and throbbed. His will rebelled. He was brooding on revenge, but his patience seemed to cost him so much effort that I feared he would have a stroke of apoplexy. At one point we came upon a large crowd gathered before a speaker, no doubt a teacher or interpreter of the law, who stood leaning against a pillar under the wooden roof of a shop and addressed himself to the assembled. So absorbed were they in his words that they did not hear the sound of the trumpets which heralded our coming. Either that, or else they deliberately ignored us and did not get out of our way. It was as well that we were not accompanied at this point by our German cavalry. A couple of our legionaries sprang from the ranks, and with the points of their broadswords reminded the Jews of the presence of the imperial representative. They simply scattered the mob and opened up a way for the litter and its cortege. Looking again at Pilate, I could see that he was no longer red with anger. He had turned almost blue, but soon the flame of his rage died down. The promising glitter of gold soothed his fiery mood. We were marching along the eastern side of the court of the Gentiles when we came suddenly upon a gate which made us open our eyes with speechless amazement. We had heard a great deal concerning the immeasurable opulence of the temple, but the sight of a huge gate of solid Corinthian bronze staggered us. This was the entry to the court of the women, which was densely crowded, for access was afforded here to Gentile as well as Jewish women. The gate had been left open, whether by inadvertence or not I could not tell, and scarcely had we taken in the sight of this incredible mass of Corinthian bronze when we caught, from the other side of the court of the women, a blinding glare of gold. We saw not a gate, but an enormous tower, covered with gold, leading from the court of the women into the inner temple. As we learned later, this was in fact the beautiful gate, of which we had heard even in Rome, a gift to the temple from just one rich Jew of Jerusalem. Above that tower gate hung a huge golden cluster of grapes, the emblem of the Jews. But the quick glimpse which we obtained of the glories beyond that gate was beyond all our imaginings. The temple was built in the form of a pyramid. There was an ascent of high steps from one hall to the other, and the inmost temple stood like a mountain of gold on a lofty marble platform. Whichever way we looked, gold, always gold, flashing in the light of the afternoon sun. Our eyes watered with weariness, astonishment, and appetite. But soon the alarm sounded, blown on huge ram's horns by the sentinels on the outlook posts, and the huge bronze doors swung to before our eyes. We saw now only the nearer gates, and we observed that on their glittering and fine-wrought surface there appeared no image of man or beast. It was as though their God Jehovah was jealous of the imaginations of men, and would permit no adornment in his temple, demanding to be served with that which he alone had created, the bare material given to man. And indeed, these gates, like the temple as a whole, produced an overwhelming effect. It was as though the elements themselves had wrought this structure, which seemed therefore to have risen out of the earth. And looking now at Pontius Pilate, I saw amazement written on his face. "Procurator," I said, "the first thing you will have to do on reaching the Antonia is to send for leeches to have the bad blood drawn from your veins. I am thinking of very different methods for ridding myself of my bad blood. I know it, Procurator, by drawing the blood of the Jews." He tried to laugh.